We start with a local copper pulling up to a road traffic incident. He walks down a hillside in silence as he sees more wrecked motors than in a GTA mission. Eventually, he comes across a little girl and tells her not to be afraid, before hilariously getting all afraid himself when she turns around with half her face chewed off. Unfortunately for her, this fella fucking hates little girls with half a face, so he randomly decides to blow her full face off rather than rush to take her to the hospital and get her some medical treatment like a sane person would. And before you can say, I'm not sure having your protagonist indulging in a bit of kiddie killing in your opening pre-credit sequence really aids in the audience sympathising with and rooting for him, especially when it's never brought up again, we cut to the opening titles, before two men chat shit about their wives leaving lights on in the house and how they don't open up to their partners enough about their feelings and stuff. Turns out the straight-up child killer from the cold opening is a deputy sheriff called Rick Grimes, and his crime-fighting partner sitting beside him is that Punisher fella, aka Shane Walsh. Anyway, they soon rush off to stop some criminals doing a bunch of bad things, and poor Rick totally gets tagged in the shootout. But luckily, it hits him square in a bulletproof vest. So Shane says, stop nonsense about like a right drama queen and let's go finish off these bozos. Rick, however, panics like a riot cuck about what his wife is going to say about him getting himself shot up, before another random thug crawls out of the grass and poor Rick gets his fucking armpit blown off. Later, he awakes from a coma and a blurry Shane gives him some flowers in the ICU, before Rick tries to respond but realises nobody cares. And even the flowers have shriveled up and died listening to his garbled drivel. And before you can say, how has he survived this long without food and fluids, he falls out of bed and wonders why no fucker is coming to help him up, and storms off to complain to management about how their nurses are incompetent and must be slacking off and shit. Or maybe just on loan from the NHS. Anyway, there doesn't seem to be anyone around and none of the phones work. And more worryingly, there's totally a skinned cadaver lying in the middle of the floor like a prop from a Predator movie. Taking in more of his surroundings, this Rick Grimes fella, who's looking pretty grimy himself to be fair, sees the Hozzie is in a right old state, and there's blood all over the walls and no soap left in the sanitizer machines. Cool, no wonder COVID's still about with such sloppy health practices in place. Then he comes across a door with a giant fuck-off bar and chain padlock across the handles, whilst the words, "Don't Dead Open Inside" are spray-painted across the doors, evidently written by some dyslexic prick who can't spell check for shit. Suddenly, though, some horny fucker in a desperate need of a manicure tries to finger the lock, so Ricky Boy decides it's time to get the fuck out of Dodge. But things aren't much better outside, and he has to walk past a bunch of bodies what are so ugly they have to have their faces covered up. Yes, exactly like Antifa goons. Then he comes across a literal half-dead girl, the top half mostly, and just stares at her pathetic form before sticking two fingers up and totally stealing her bike. Well, it's not like she'll be using it anytime soon, given some fuckers run off with her legs. And before you can say, hang on, why weren't that other flesh-eating dead woman a zombie too when her head was still intact? We arrive at his family home to find it emptier than AOC's head, before he has a total meltdown and cries on the floor like a riot cack. Then this grimy Rick fella, what loves to steal dead girls' bikes, sits on his lawn and waves hello to a random bloke shuffling his way down the street, before getting the full Little Nicky treatment and being smacked in the face with a shovel, whilst hilariously mistaking a black boy for his white son Carl, as his black daddy shoots at random shuffling bloke in the brains before being totally baffled as to why this one with a hairy chest is totally talking garbled drivel and shit. He demands to know what the bandage is for, but the dude totally passes out before he can say he's just had an armpit transplant. Or some shit. Later, he wakes up in another bed as the black daddy dude patches him up and questions about whether he got bit or scratched. Or worse, stood within 6 feet of an unmasked person at the self-checkout in his local branch of Lidl. Rick confirms that he's a basic bitch and it's just a boring gunshot wound, bro. And the black daddy confirms he has no temperature by putting his palm on his forehead and then popping his finger up his poop chute. Though that part was off screen, I think. Also later, the badass black daddy says his name is Morgan Jones, and he and his boy Dwayne are totally squatting at some rando's gaff, despite Rick saying that this is actually his mate's house, and Fred and Sydney Drakes are going to be well pissed that these homeless hobos have set up shop in their living room whilst they're away on vacation from life. Morgan bemoans about how he stupidly fired that gun and has now drawn a boatload of deadites to their doorstep, kind of like how milkshakes bring all the boys to their yard. Or some shit. So they have dinner whilst Morgan tells him he straight up slept through a fucking apocalypse. And really? I mean, I've heard of deep sleepers, but this is taking the piss, son. So he expo dumps all over his arse and explains the rules of the universe. which is basically that the world's gone to shit and the dead have reanimated because reasons. And the only rules are don't get bit, because bites cause a fever and the fever burns you out. Then you totally turn and come back as a straggly looking smelly bloke, aka Iggy Pop on a good day. Suddenly, an alarm goes off outside, and it turns out it's just one of those dead peeps aimlessly bumping into a motor. But little Dwayne cries like a right cuck at seeing his dead mum still alive, but just a bit depressed looking. And then his dad cries, because he should have put her down, but couldn't. So now she's out there roaming around the streets like a half-price hooker and twisting random knobs for eternity. LOL! The next morning, Morgie says you've got to get him in the head to destroy the brain, or else they'll keep sticking around like some useless bag of bones who won't ever die. Yes! Exactly like Nancy Pelosi. So they go back to Rick's gaff and find some nutter has nicked all their wall photos and shit art deco. You know, the kind of tat that says live, laugh, love. But he reckons that's just proof his wife and son are alive, and Dwayne states they've likely gone to Atlanta, because there was totally a refugee centre there. Well, at least before the broadcast stopped. And also the military told them all to come to their yard, because they have food and shelter and the CDC set up there. And presumably lots of milkshakes. But first they hit up the police station and have a hot shower, because it still has running water due to it operating on its own propane system. Morgan says he's struggling to move on, given his dead wife keeps literally haunting him every night. So Rick goes to the armoury and hands him a scoped rifle, so he can totally blow his wife's brains out and finally cheer up a bit. Hilariously, the boy wants to shoot her as well, but Rick tells little Dwayne that he's still young and too much of a noob to handle this heat. And when you pull the trigger, you totally have to mean it. Which is what my dad always taught me when giving me safety lessons for my Super Soaker 5000, what I got for Christmas '95. Anyway, they go to part ways, but then Rick's ex-colleague Leon Bassett shuffles over to say hi. And Ricky Boy goes and speaks ill of the dead right in front of his mate's corpse by saying that he never thought much of him anyway, because he was totally careless and dumb when he was alive and ironically still in need of some brains. He doesn't want to leave him in such a state, however, and so naturally blows his brains out harder than Kurt Cobain high on the smack. Bruh. Later, Rick goes for a walk in the park, whilst Morgan shoots some innocent dead peeps just minding their own business like a right hateful bigot, as Rick returns to that literal half-dead girl and says sorry this happened to you, but doesn't apologise for totally stealing her bike earlier. Wowzers! What a terrible deputy sheriff this guy is, stealing personal property and then not even returning it after use. Meanwhile, Morgs finally spots his wife through the scope, and he can't believe she dared leave the house without even running a hairbrush through a barnet, and he just bursts into tears of what a sorry stinky state she's become, especially wandering around in public and embarrassing their family like that. Also later, Rick sends a message across the airwaves using his police radio, but like Joe Biden's skull, he gets nothing but static. Although some randos in the field do pick up his message, but can't seem to get their responses through. This group is just outside the city, and includes that Shane Walsh geezer what loves punishing people over in the MCU, and also Rick's wife Laurie and his son Carl. But unfortunately, Shane and Laurie now seem to be in a post-apocalyptic relationship, given they snog each other's faces off in a small tent. Elsewhere, Rick's so far gone that he tries to softly talk to a stallion like he's a real-life horse whisperer, and then trots off down a quiet and empty highway. And before you can say, this'll end well, he rides straight into a horde of the dead whilst chasing the reflection of a helicopter, before the grimy fuckers bring down that Grimes fucker and totally eats his horse, till he is quickly surrounded and has to hide under an abandoned tank. But the grotty fellas start crawling towards him from all sides, and it looks like it's curtains for the corrupt deputy sheriff what loves nicking bikes and shooting little girls in the head. And trapped, he totally tries to self-abort, before miraculously finding a small hatch under the tank and clambers inside. But he doesn't even get a moment to clean the shit out of his pants before yet another one of these undead bozos tries to gobble him up like he's a walking chicken McNugget. So he's forced to shoot the Zombo in a metallic airtight environment and naturally ends up deafening himself like a right wally. So he pops up to the upper hatch to get some fresh air and stabilise his ringing ears, before seeing how truly screwed he is and then climbing back inside like a right pussy old melt. And just as all seems well and truly lost, a voice comes over the radio like a guardian angel, who proceeds to call him a dumbass and ask if he's cosy in there, as Rick just stares in bewilderment whilst an aerial drone shot shows just how fucked Atlanta is, with hundreds of thousands of brain-dead zombies uselessly shuffling around in the streets whilst destroying public property. Which sounds kind of like current-day San Francisco, to be fair. And that's it. That's the first epi. But man, what a start. This Frank Darabont fella sure knows how to keep you on edge. Though not sure his characters are the sharpest tools in the shed. I mean, Rick sure seemed surprised when he almost rode into a full herd of walkers. But honestly, what do you expect going into an overpopulated urban city during a zombie outbreak, my guy? I know Atlanta is often too hot to think straight, but you're going to have to adapt fast and gain some common sense if you're going to survive the next 9 seasons. But anyway, on to episode 2. We start at a campsite, where Shane's group has set up a temporary base near the woods like a bunch of gypsies. Laurie then asks an old geezer called Dale to watch her boy, who seems to be so poor that he has to sit around and play with mud, because she's on her way out to the trees for a naughty saucy sex session with her dead husband's best friend. And before you can say, wowzers, is this really where little Judith the arse-kicker first gets conceived? Shane's flipped her on her front and given her a right good seeing to, and just in front of her wedding ring. Which makes sense, I suppose, because when the world ends, you might as well spend every waking moment copulating in a copse. Anyway, after the opening titles, we cut to that grimy Rick fella who's still stuck in the tank, as the producers reuse the first epi's ending shot but in reverse, because this shit's expensive and AMC needs to get their money's worth, bro. The voice over the radio then tells him to run for it whilst the dead fellas are totally distracted stuffing their face with horse meat. And no, I don't just mean dining at McDonald's, although it does seem to be quite a happy meal. So Rick pops out of the hatch and gives some poor chap a Glasgow smile, before indeed racing to get the F out of Dodge. But the dopey bloke soon starts running in random directions whilst aimlessly unloading a full clip into various walkers. And at this point, he may as well be ringing the fucking dinner bell, son. Luckily, he runs into a small Asian, who was totally the voice on the radio what rudely called him a dumbass, before they climb up a fire escape to safety. He says his name's Glenn, but with 2 N's. But before Rick can say, I don't really give a shit, the smelly scabby dead fellas start climbing up the ladder. Now out of options, they ascend to the roof before entering a small hatch which leads down to an abandoned building. And they soon escape through the back before being confronted by 2 rotters who are standing between them and the department store door. Luckily, some masked up goons burst out and totally slaughter the zombozos, and thereby rescue the pair of Egypts just in the nick of time. Once inside, poor Rick barely has time to adjust his underpants before some blonde bird called Andrea sticks a gat in his face and says he looks like the kind of fella who likes to go around stealing bikes. I mean, she bollocks him for totally screwing him, because firing off all those shots willy-nilly has totally drawn all the dead fellas to their yard, and they don't have any more milkshakes to hand out. Or some shit. Anyway, even more gunshots start going off, so they race up to the roof and find a white southern racist toxic redneck in a leather vest popping off heads of innocent dead guys just minding their own business down in the street. Naturally, the black guy called T-Dog tells him to chill out already, because you're totally wasting all our bullets, bro. But in a shocking twist no one could ever see coming, turns out the white southern toxic sexist guy is a bona fide racialist to boot, and totally hates taking orders from chocolate blokes with stupid names, before dropping the N-word and hilariously smacking the shit out of the whole entire group. He then pulls an Andrea and sticks a gat in his face, before telling the group that he's a big fan of democracy, and they better vote for him to be in charge or else they'll totally get a taste of transhumanism when their forehead merges with a metal bullet. Naturally, he gets 81 million votes, but Ricky boy ain't got time for that. So he sneaks up and disarms the naughty racist before cuffing him to a small pipe. Turns out his name is Mel Dixon, and Rick tells him that there's no differences between people anymore, only between the living and the dead, so he better wake up and stop thinking in terms of chalk ices versus mini milks and totally get on board already. Later, T-Dog tries to hail their buddies for some assistance, but like the inside of Diane Abbott's skull, there ain't nothing but static. A fella named Morales then confirms that the military advertised refugee centre is no longer around, and that they're totally on their own, isn't she? After hilariously calling Andrea a rug muncher because she rejects his offer to unlock his cuffs so they can go and bump uglies, Rick has an idea to use the sewers to escape. But Glenn with 2 N's can't see any manhole covers in the streets, so it looks like they're totally boned. But this Jackie bird says that actually Old buildings like this often had drainage tunnels leading to the sewers, because she totally used to work at the local council before all the world went to hell. Or some shit. But luckily, there is indeed such a tunnel down in said basement, and the group volunteer poor old Glenn to go explore it. And having 2 N's in his name sure ain't gonna save him now. So he reluctantly agrees, but on the condition that he only takes one other person with him, because otherwise the rest of the group will just slow him down, probably get him killed when things inevitably go tits up. So he chooses to take that rugged Morales fella on a date down into his dark and smelly hole. Steady. Meanwhile, Andrea apologises to Rick for sticking a shooter in his face, and said Rick fella totally humiliates her by saying she had the safety on the whole time anyway. Lol, what a numpty. Up on the roof, Merle and T-Dog trade barbs as the white toxic racist sexist southern guy hilariously tries to bargain for his release by insulting the black geezers some more.
Not a great plan.
Glenn and Morales then indeed find a tunnel leading to a sewer, but unfortunately they won't have time to cut through the wire before the zombos upstairs break through the glass, so this is totally a literal and figurative dead end. Said zombos then totally break through the first pane of glass and get closer to munching them all up real good and proper, so they're going to need a plan B and pretty fast. Brainstorming on the roof, Glenn mentions the only reason he could get Rick out of that tank was because the horde was totally distracted. So Rick says we just need to do that again then, and suggests that if they all just smell dead, then they might be able to totally trick the deceased peeps with rotting noses. So they rush out and grab one of those zombie chaps what they smacked up earlier, and after pausing to learn about this fella's backstory that no one cares about, Rick starts hacking up the corpse and then smearing the guts all over each other. Though he's also careful to remind them to not get the virulent infected blood on their skin or in their eyes, which is rather quaint and hilarious when you look at Fear the Walking Dead, where that Nick fella treats zombie guts like hot sauce and seems to put that shit on everything. LOL! Once fully disguised in a dead man's entrails, Rick tosses the handcuff keys over to T-Dog. You know, the bloke who the super toxic southern sexist racist guy was racist toward, which got him cuffed up in the first place. And at this point, I just have to facepalm, cause giving the bitter oppressed victim the key to his oppressor's freedom probably ain't the smartest idea coming from an actual cop who wants to keep the peace and also should totally know better. No! But anyway, Ricky Boy and the Asian chap then go full Shaun of the Dead, and soon cosplay as the current POTUS by pretending to be a brain-dead zombie. Luckily, this trick totally works, and somehow completely bamboozles the dead fellas with decomposing senses. Whilst the rest of the group just watch from the roof as ominous storm clouds gather above. Meanwhile, back at the gypsy campsite, Andrea's sister Amy worries about how long it's taking for their friends to get back from the supply run. But old geezer Dale says chill out babe, because worrying won't make it better. Suddenly though, they hear T-Dog's warbled cries for help over the walkie and whining about how they're all totally trapped in a small department store before the transmission cuts off. But Shane just shrugs and says, well that sucks, but it's totally too bad, isn't she? Because he just can't risk any more of his group to go out and rescue him. And besides, they knew the risks anyhow. Naturally, this pisses off the Amy bird royally, especially when he implies that her beloved sibling is totally gone and she should just get over it already. Elsewhere, Rick and Glenn are making good progress walking in the street and pretending to be a Gen Z TikToker. I mean a lobotomized zombie. Unfortunately, they've completely mistimed their desperate plan and have only gone and walked out just when it was about to chuck it down. So the heavens open and the rain soon begins washing off the scent of stinky guts and literal shit, before the walkers start to notice that these two now smell like delicious chicken McNuggets and totally turn on a pair of wet wallies. So they're soon forced to make a run for it, before climbing a fence and stealing a truck. Man, this deputy sheriff is a right naughty boy. Ironically though, the rain totally stops just as they get in the van, almost like it was just a plot device to inject some much needed tension into the scene. But they then drive off, as Rick plans to save the group by distracting the zombies via loud noises to get them to follow him. And before he can say, that's exactly what we do to our dementia-ridden granddad when he goes off on walkabout from the care home, Rick hotwires a second car, which Glenn then uses to herd the herd away from the loading bay doors. Whilst up on the roof, the group pack up their shit and run downstairs, leaving the super southern sexist toxic racist guy to swivel. But the black fella with a preposterous name is too kind-hearted to let a literal white supremacist die horrifically whilst totally defenceless. So, against his better judgment, he returns to unlock the cuffs, but unfortunately, he's a giant mockadon, and totally trips over a bag of tools and drops the key down a small hole. Now more screwed than an aging porn star, Merle reckons that the black guy what he irrationally hates totally did that on purpose. Before T-Dog panics and runs back down to catch their ride, leaving Merle stuck to a little pipe and whinging like a ride cat. But T-Dog at least has a good grace to secure the roof door with a chain and padlock, so that Merle fella can mercifully starve to death rather than become an all-you-can-eat buffet for rotting monsters. Whilst down below, Rick picks them up and drives them off to safety, whilst Glenn speeds down the empty highway screaming in joy and relief now he's finally free and still breathing, and presumably because he can now enact his secret dream of cosplaying as Han from Tokyo Drift and do lots of speeding without getting a ticket from the local plod. And that's it. That's episode 2. Though my favourite part was where Rick pauses to honour that random zombie before carving him up like a common hog, and then totally promises to tell his family about this Wayne chap if he ever reunites with them. Aw, what a nice guy. Doesn't quite make up for stealing bikes and shooting children between the eyes, but it's certainly a start, I guess. But anyway, that's the plot and that's your lot. Considering that mail thing so you don't miss episodes 3 and 4 when they drop. Tell me if you like this series in the comments if you have time, and I'll see you in the next one.